Hey everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. Um, so obviously I am out, but we do have some information that we need to get through today, especially with the snowstorm coming in. Not quite sure how many days this week I'm going to see you, so I want to make sure that I cover enough to be where we need to be. All right, so let's get started. All right, so we're going to be starting going through chapter 35, the impact of World War II on Americans. So when I start going through this, I want you to pause every once in a while, and I actually want you to watch the videos that I point out for you. Okay, so on December 7th, 1941, um, on December 7th, 1941, we have Pearl Harbor. Okay, Pearl Harbor happens. We've already talked about this. The Japanese committed a sneak attack against the United States, and a day later, on December 8th, 1941, the United States officially declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. A few days later, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States. So the United States now has to kind of play catch up a little bit to get to the point where the rest of the world is when it comes to actually making war. All right. So this video, I want you to pause my video and I want you to click on it and watch this video. Okay. World War II Homefront. I hope that it's not blocked for you. If it is, it's not that big of a deal. Just remind me when I get in next time I see you that you didn't get to watch it, and we'll watch it together. Okay. So very similar to World War I, the United States, the federal government organizes basically private industry into war making industries. Okay, so a good example of this would be like Ford Motor Company is no longer making cars; they're now making airplanes. Okay, remember from World War One compared to and World War II, these companies wanted to be in that position during war because when the government purchases, 100 tanks, for a fact that those things are getting sold. All right. So it's good for businesses. All right. But a couple of important things similar to World War One. So organizing the American economy for war, we have the War Production Board. Very important for you to know. Okay. So make sure you write this down or highlight it. Okay. So the goal of the War Production Board was to make America the arsenal of democracy. Basically, we're converting our industry over to wartime rather than peacetime. So automakers like Ford are now making airplanes and tanks instead of cars. Other workers are now retrained workers for wartime tasks. Not only that, but we have minorities and we have women being hired in the positions that white males originally had in these original positions. Okay, so we're seeing a very similar change, a very similar dynamic from World War I to World War II. All right. Now, because of this, because the government is spending, we see the GDP, the gross domestic product, so the things that are being bought in the United States, rise rapidly, which is great for the United States economy. World War II was like really the main reason, the last push that the United States economy needed to actually get pulled out of the Great Depression. Now, the New Deal certainly helped things, but it wasn't the end all be all. All right. Then you have the National War Labor Board. Okay. This one mediates disputes between union leaders and business owners to make sure that we don't have any stoppages of work. All right. So the government makes sure that union leaders and business leaders are working together for the war effort. Again, very similar to World War I stuff. Now, because the United States, the government is paying for all of this, we see a rise in levels. Okay, so the government has to figure out how are we going to pay for all of this. So taxes accounted for 45% of the war. Okay, so almost half of the war was paid for by taxes. We also then have war bonds. Again, very similar to World War I. War bonds are helping finance the war. All right. So if you can't remember from World War I what war bonds are, and we'll look at pictures on Wednesday if we're all together. All right. Those war bonds are there to basically it's a loan to the government. All right. So if I buy a $10 war bond in 25 years, that $10 is now worth $100. Okay. It's just I got to make sure that I hold on to my bond card and so I can actually cash it. Now, after that 25 years, it doesn't continue to go up. You can cash it earlier, but you're not going to wind up getting, that $100. You got to wait the whole 25 years. Okay. But a good portion of our war effort was paid for by those war bonds. Again, similar to World War I. All right. Then you have price controls because we don't want to have any type of inflation. All right. So price controls are needed on everyday normal products. Okay. They don't want bread costing, $50 when you go to the grocery store. All right. So the Office of the Price Administration makes sure that we don't have price gouging and inflation. All right. People were back to working and earning money, but goods were scarce because of the war effort. So too much money chasing too few of goods. We have an inflation. Okay. Excuse me. We see that kind of right now because, if you ever go to the grocery store with your parents, especially at Meijer, you start seeing like these little signs next to certain goods that say only grab 2, or you can only grab up to 3 of these. That would be like the Office of the Price Administration trying to make sure that they're regulating and rationing those goods off to people. So that way we don't see, people running, trying to buy all the toilet paper possible. All right. Rationing is necessary, okay, during a war effort because all of these goods are going towards the war effort. Okay. So gasoline, tires, sugar, and food. Whoops. That's on me. There we go. Head back to that original slide. All right. Now, gasoline, tires, sugar, food, all of that stuff is rationed. Okay. So just like World War I, Americans received a coupon book that limits consumption. So if you wanted to buy a pound of sugar, you better hope that you have a coupon in your coupon book for that. Because if not, you're not getting that pound of sugar. All right. We already talked about funding comes from taxes and borrowing bonds, so we don't have to keep talking about that. Another thing, I always like to bring up this story. Another thing that was rationed during World War II was nylons. All right. Now, nylon mainly back during the 1940s was mainly used for nylons for women. All right. But during the 1940s, that nylon was actually needed to help make parachutes during the war. So that was another thing that was going to be rationed. And that's why after really the 1940s going into the 1950s, you don't see as many people wearing nylons around anymore. Okay, they kind of went out of fashion because of the war. All right. American GIs. Okay, so these were your men that were going to war. If you remember in 1940, we had a draft. All right. We had about 1.5 million troops by Pearl Harbor because of that draft. Now, the term GI actually stands for government issued. All right. So if you ever played with GI Joes as a kid, GI means government issued. So you're really playing with government issued Joe. All right. So American GIs after Pearl Harbor have to prepare to go to war. Okay. After Pearl Harbor, we have a ton of volunteers trying to join the military. All right. Immigrants also wanted to show that they were truly Americans, so they wound up actually joining the wars as well. The American GIs, unlike the First World War, so we see a little bit a difference here because if you remember the First World War, they're supposed to get like 6 to 8 weeks of training, and they rarely got that. In the Second World War, we have 8 weeks of intense training for combat. All right. During that 8 weeks, GIs felt fear, loneliness, homesickness, boredom. They had to deal with physical, emotional, and mental wounds that surfaced during and after the war. Okay. and they appreciated American ideals after viewing the abuse of European dictators. Okay, lots of pride, lots of loyalty came along with that. But we'll talk more about what they saw when we actually get to the war portion of this unit. Okay, minorities during World War II. All right. Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor were targeted. All right. People were very weary of them. They thought that they could be enemies. Now, Japanese Americans weren't the only people that were targeted, but Japanese Americans were put in internment camps. Okay, internment camps with the executive order of 9066 sent Japanese Americans, mainly from the West Coast, California area, to internment camps in Wyoming, Montana, right around there. All right. I have a picture of these internment camps on the next slide. Now, enemy aliens. Okay, so Germans, Italians, Japanese immigrants had to register with the government and carry identification cards with them. Japanese Americans didn't have really any political powers. And when the executive order 9066 was passed by FDR, thousands of Japanese Americans were sent to these internment camps. Now, while in these internment camps, here's a picture of the internment camps right up here. So barracks, okay, it was surrounded by barbed wire. All right. Fred Korematsu, who was a young kid during this time period, was a native-born citizen, so he's American. He didn't believe that this was right, so he disobeyed the law, and he took the United States to court, which you guys had already read about. All right, the court upheld that decision in Korematsu versus the United States, basically saying that a group's civil rights can be set aside during times of war. Now, 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were forced to relocate into guarded barracks, so out in Montana, Idaho, that area. But eventually, Japanese Americans were allowed to join the military and fight in the European theater. Japanese Americans weren't allowed to fight in the Pacific theater. But the 442nd Regiment Combat Team was an all-Japanese unit, and they went out with something to prove, and they were one of the most decorated regiments in all of World War II. Now, women during World War II. We have a lot of propaganda out there. All right, and we'll talk about propaganda on Wednesday. But Rosie the Riveter wasn't a real person. All right, Rosie the Riveter wasn't real. She was a propaganda creation. But we had tons and tons of women going out and working in these highly demanded jobs. All right, they still faced a lot of hostility in male-dominated businesses. And they were still expected to complete their domestic duties. But women were able to go out and work in these male-dominated areas like factories. All right. We also see the Women Army Corps being created. The Women's Army Corps allowed women to join the military. They weren't fighting on the front lines. They were in non-combat units. But we see rights being expanded for women during World War II. Waves, so women accepted for volunteer emergency service. This was basically the WWII program, but for the Navy. Then you have African Americans during World War II. The WWII campaign, so victory for democracy at home and abroad. This was the idea that African Americans are still facing prejudice and racism at home. So not only should they be fighting for civil rights and democracy abroad, but they also need to be fighting for democracy and civil rights at home as well. Now, black GIs were segregated and originally were not permitted in combat at first. All right. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen changed this. Okay, the Tuskegee Airmen were African Americans who flew in the Air Force. Okay, they were bomber escorts. So and they were in direct combat. All right, they were the only fighter group to never lose a bomber to enemy planes. Okay, it proved that African Americans can fight in the Air Force and in the military. All right, the Tuskegee Airmen. There's a really cool movie out there called The Tuskegee Airmen. I don't know if I can find it, but it's a very, very cool movie. All right, but Tuskegee Airmen breaking down the stereotypes or the idea that African Americans can't fight in the military. All right, we see another great migration. All right, so African Americans escaping the South, not racism. All right, moving to those northern industrial centers, just like in World War I. The National Urban League was created. All right, so the NUL fought for equal opportunities in housing and employment, making sure that there weren't just certain areas in town that African Americans were allowed to live. We also have CORE, so Congress of Racial Equality, and this is going to come up a lot, especially during the civil rights movement. So CORE, this is important. CORE is going to come up, so write this down. All right, they confronted discrimination with nonviolent resistance. So when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're going to see, peaceful protests or sit-ins or a few other things that we're going to talk about as well. All right. Now, at the same time, the Executive Order 9066 interned the Japanese Americans. We have the Executive Order of 8802, which outlawed the discrimination against African Americans in the defense industry. Basically, what that means is a employer can't not hire you or can't fire you just because you're an African American. All right, Jewish Americans in World War II. When we start talking about the Holocaust, we'll talk about what European Jews had to go through, especially in Germany and Poland, when Hitler rose to power. All right, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, occurred in Nazi Germany in 1938. Mobs burned Jewish synagogues and businesses. 90 Jewish people were killed and 30,000 were sent to concentration camps after this. We'll spend a lot more time talking about that when we get into the Holocaust. All right. In 1924, we have the National Origins Act that restricted immigration to the United States. Okay, remember we had a lot of nativism at that point. People were afraid of the Red Scare. We do see anti-Semitism, all right? But in 1944, the United States created the War Refugee Board, okay? This is important, this part. War Refugee Board was created in 1944 to help Jewish refugees, all right, find homes. All right, Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans also dealt with discrimination. All right, in 1943, we had the Zoot Suit riots. So Zoot Suits were associated with Mexican teenagers, all right, and gangs that roamed Los Angeles. Now, mobs of sailors and Marines sought out Mexicans and other people wearing Zoot Suits and wound up beating them up. This is just an example of racial prejudice and intolerance that was going on during World War II. All right. Now, during the war, laborers were needed. All right, the Buquero program allowed short-term work contracts to be filled by Mexicans in farms and on railroads, because prior to that, Mexicans were discriminated against in many fields or jobs in the United States. All right, and that's where we're going to stop today. So if you still have time left, you should be working on those maps that you got last week. All right? Okay. I hope everybody has a great day.